to look at patterns, and a pattern is a two-dimensional representation of a 3D figure. And it results in when you take that figure and you separate it into two or more individual shapes. So unlike a net diagram where all the shapes are still connected to each other, a pattern is where you split the three-dimensional figures into its constituent small two-dimensional shapes. So one example of a pattern arises when you take a piece of clothing apart at the seam. So all of your clothes have a seam at them somewhere, and so you could remove the thread and thus take your garment apart into various smaller pieces that were sewn together to make a whole pair of jeans or shirt or skirt or whatever it happens to be. So if you have a skirt, for example, if you were to separate it into different pieces, you'd end up with a pattern. And so what you see down here is the skirt pattern. And so where you'd actually have the seams would be down this side and down this side, and that would connect this side and this side of that skirt. And so you're actually sewing together those two components. So in patterns, you often have to account for the seams or for flaps that you would use to put glue together and whatnot. That would allow for separate pieces to be attached together. And so where would the seams have to be in the above example? Well, we just showed you where we've got the two blue lines. Okay, so you'd have the seams rather going from the bottom of the skirt to the top to the waist on both sides, and though you would sew those two things together in order to get one complete skirt. Okay. So if we're going to design another example of a pattern, let's try and name the figure and then draw the corresponding net in the space below. So for example, if I wanted to draw, say, a beach ball. Okay, so here I've got my beach ball. And so at the top of the beach ball, it splits into multiple pieces. And so if you could, you're not going to you're not going to sew a beach ball together, but what you are going to do is you're going to end up gluing those different colored flaps together. So if you were to actually separate it, you'd have a single piece in the middle. Okay, that would be a circle, and that would be at the pole of your beach ball. But then you'd also have multiple pieces that ended up kind of part triangle pieces. Okay. And so what you could actually end up doing with these pieces is you could glue them together. And so the seams here, what you could do is you could actually glue them together along the sides. So the sides would join together. Okay, so all of those sides would join together. And along the top, that would also glue together right there. Okay, and so those things combined together would ultimately make your beach ball design. So nets versus patterns. If we consider a basic cereal box, okay, and we drew a cereal box a couple of times before, but if we consider basic cereal box, we'll sketch both a net for the cereal box, and then we'll also sketch a pattern for the cereal box. Okay, so first off, I'm going to sketch my cereal box. So okay, so there's my basic cereal box design. And so if I want to make a net diagram of my cereal box, okay, again, my cereal box is going to have it's going to have a front and a back. It'll have a top and a bottom, and it'll have a right side and a left side. So my cereal box will have a front, it'll have a top, it'll have a left side, it'll have a right side, it'll have a bottom side, and it'll have a back side. Okay, so that, for example, we've got a front, a top, a bottom, a left, a right, and a back side. Okay, if I was to do the cereal box as a pattern, okay, instead of all of those sides being connected together like they are here, if I was to draw this as a pattern, what I'd end up with is a piece that was like that. Okay, so I have a top, I'd have a front, I'd have a bottom, I'd have a back, I'd have a left side, and I'd have a right side. Okay, so if I quickly label it, I've got a top, a front, a bottom, a back, a left, and a right. Now, because they're not connected, if I was to actually try and manufacture this particular box, I would need to have a little bit more material around the edges. So I would need some material along this side and along this side. Okay, so flaps on either side that I could use to glue together my box. Okay, so you're actually using a little bit more material in a pattern than you would in a net diagram. And that's often the reason why when you disassemble a box, you end up actually having a net diagram instead of a pattern. Okay? So you actually have to add in a little bit more material around the perimeter of each part of that pattern, each of the geometric shapes, in order to allow for those pieces to come together. Okay? So if you does a net or a pattern make more sense in this situation? Well, I suppose that's a little bit up to individual preference. But I would argue actually that in this particular situation for the manufacturer of a cereal box, that a net diagram is probably much easier. Okay, and the net diagram would be easier to manufacture. There's less glue, less material that would be required to make it. That would make the box a little bit cheaper. It also, because it's a single piece of material, it would be a little stronger. And so therefore, a net diagram would seem to be the best possible option in this particular case.